In the 15th century, Portugal was one of the poorest, most peripheral nations in Europe, a thin strip of land on the Atlantic edge of the continent, hemmed in by a powerful neighbor, with barely 1.5 million people and no obvious future. Today, the sea routes that nation charted still carry the majority of the world's trade. The language it spread across 4 continents is spoken by 250 million people. The global economy runs in no small part on a skeleton that Portugal built. How a country that's small sees that much of the world is a story about far more than exploration. It is a story about strategy, about calculated violence, about an empire that never needed to own the land because it owned the water around it. So it is also a story about what it costs to hold something that vast together, and what happens when the cost finally becomes too great to bear. Portugal in 1400 sat at the extreme western edge of the known world, pressed against the Atlantic by a more powerful neighbor to the east, and with nothing to the south but the last contested ground of a 700-year religious war. Castile had already tried to absorb the kingdom once. The great powers of continental Europe were growing in territory, in wealth, in ambition. Portugal was doing none of those things. It was a small, battered kingdom at the end of a peninsula with a long coastline, a thin economy, and no obvious way forward. Portugal in 1400 was not a promising place. Its population stood at roughly 1 million people. Its economy was localized and fragile: wine, salt, and dried fruit, a little cloth. It imported armor, fine goods, and manufactured products from Flanders and Italy because it could not produce them itself. The bubonic plague had swept through in the previous century, emptying the countryside and pushing the living toward the coast. The kingdom had been battered and its land abandoned. Only the sea offered an alternative. The political situation was barely more stable than the economy. In 1383, King Ferdinand I had died without a male heir, and Castile had immediately pressed its dynastic claim on the Portuguese throne. What followed was 2 years of civil war, siege, and near annexation. It was a bastard son of the old royal line, João of Aviz, who held the kingdom together, rallying the merchants of Lisbon and the lesser nobility against the Castilian faction. On the 14th of August, 1385, at the Battle of Aljubarrota, his outnumbered army destroyed the Castilian force. Portugal survived. João was crowned King John I, and the House of Aviz took the throne. But the kingdom he inherited was exhausted, and its borders were as fixed as they would ever be. Castile to the east was too powerful to fight again. The interior offered nothing new, no land to conquer, no wealth to unlock. Every territorial ambition that faced east was a dead end. What John I understood, and what his sons would carry forward, was that the only direction left was the one no one else had seriously attempted. Not east, not south across the land, west, and then down into the ocean. This was not the reasoning of explorers driven by curiosity. It was the cold logic of a small state with nowhere else to go. Portugal needed wealth, it needed influence, and it needed a role in the European order that its size and geography could not otherwise justify. The sea was the only arena where a kingdom of 1 million people could compete with kingdoms of 10 million. What made Portugal different from every other Atlantic nation in this moment was that it understood this first, and it began to build systematically toward the only future available to it. The Portuguese coastline was long, and the population clustered around its ports. Fishing was not a hobby, but a livelihood, and generations of men had learned the Atlantic's moods, its currents, its wind patterns, its seasonal rhythms, simply by necessity. When the Crown began to invest in oceanic exploration, it was not starting from nothing. And it was redirecting skills that already existed toward a new and more ambitious purpose. The sailors were there. The ships needed to be better. The maps needed to extend further south. These were problems that could be solved. By the time John I died in 1433, the framework was already in motion. His son, Henry, the third of his children, born to an English mother, educated in the crusading tradition of his dynasty, had taken control of the country's southern fortress at Ceuta and was beginning to look down the African coast with something more than a mariner's curiosity. He was looking for the way around. What he found, and what Portugal would spend the next 60 years building on, was not a trade route. It was a machine for extracting wealth from a world that had not yet realized it was about to be reached. The Reconquista was not a single war. It was 700 years of border conflict, a slow, grinding campaign in which the Christian kingdoms of Iberia pushed the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus southward, generation by generation, century by century, until there was nowhere left to push. By 1249, Portugal had driven the last Moorish forces from its southern territory and set its borders along the lines they still follow today. The fighting was over. The ideology it had produced was not. 700 years of holy war leaves a mark on a culture that does not simply dissolve in peacetime. The Portuguese nobility had been formed by it. Their identity was built on it. The Order of Christ, the organization that would fund and legitimize much of Portugal's early expansion, was itself the direct successor to the Knights Templar. He reconstituted on Portuguese soil in 1319 with the same crusading mandate and the same expectation of war against Islam. The institutional memory of holy war was not a relic. It was operational. The crusading logic also offered something politically useful: papal authority. Between 1415 and 1500, the papacy issued 69 separate bulls pertaining to Portuguese expansion. Each one blessed a new phase of the enterprise, authorized the enslavement of non-Christians encountered along the African coast, and framed what was economically a trading and raiding operation as a work of God. This was not cynicism, or not only cynicism. The men who sailed under the cross of the Order of Christ genuinely believed they were engaged in a continuation of the Reconquista by other means. The Pope agreed. The prophets confirmed it. It's when King John I assembled his Armada in the summer of 1415 and pointed it at the North African port of Ceuta, the official justification was religious. His three sons, Edward, Peter, and Henry, needed their baptism of blood, the ritual proof of noble worth that the medieval world demanded. Ceuta, held by the Marinid Sultanate and sitting at the eastern entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar, was a Muslim city. Taking it fulfilled the crusading obligation that the dynasty had inherited. That it also happened to sit at the junction of the trans-Saharan gold routes and the Mediterranean spice trade was, in the official telling, incidental. The assault on August 21, 1415, was brief. The Marinid Sultan could not send reinforcements. His sultanate was collapsing into civil war. And the garrison that faced John's 45,000 men was a fraction of what it should have been. The city fell in a day. Henry, wounded in the fighting, distinguished himself enough to earn his spurs. Portugal had its first possession outside Europe and its first foothold on the African continent. A garrison of roughly 2,500 men was left behind as the king and his princes sailed home. Ceuta quickly became an expensive disappointment. The trans-Saharan caravans that had made the city wealthy simply rerouted to Tangier once the Portuguese took over. The gold stopped coming. The city that had been described as the key to the Mediterranean became a drain on the Portuguese treasury rather than a source of income. And the lesson was immediate, and it was structural. Controlling a city without controlling the trade routes that fed it was worthless. You could not extract wealth from a choke point you did not fully own. Henry was the third son of King John I. The right birth order for a man with ambition, but no throne in his future. He was born in 1394 to an English mother, raised in the crusading tradition of the House of Aviz, and hardened at Ceuta in 1415, where he led the assault on the Al-Medina Gate and took a wound in the fighting. He was 21 years old, had never been to sea, and would spend the next 4 decades directing the most consequential program of maritime exploration in human history without once completing an ocean voyage himself. What Henry built at Sagres, on the southernmost tip of Portugal, it was not a school in any formal sense. It was closer to a research compound, a collection of buildings on a windswept promontory where cartographers, pilots, astronomers, shipwrights, and returning sailors gathered to pool what they knew. He brought in a Jewish Majorcan cartographer named Jehuda Cresques, whose family had produced the Catalan Atlas, the most accurate map of Africa and Asia then in existence. He collected Arab geographical texts. He debriefed every captain who came back, requiring written accounts of what they had seen and the knowledge accumulated year by year, voyage by voyage, into a body of navigational intelligence that Portugal guarded as a state secret. The ship that made everything possible was the caravel. It was derived from a Portuguese fishing vessel, light, shallow-drafted, and agile, but rebuilt for oceanic work. Its triangular lateen sails allowed it to sail at an angle into the wind in a way that square-rigged Mediterranean vessels could not, which solved the central problem of Atlantic exploration: how to go south along the African coast and still get home. The caravel was not fast. It was not large. It carried a small crew and modest cargo. What it could do was go where other ships could not, and return from places other ships had never reached. For 12 years, Henry sent captains south toward Cape Bojador, a headland on the West African coast where violent currents, hidden reefs, and prevailing northerly winds had destroyed every ship that tried to pass. Arab geographers called the waters beyond it the Green Sea of Darkness. The Portuguese called it the Point of No Return. And 14 expeditions failed. In 1434, a squire from Henry's own household named Gil Eanes tried again. He swung wide of the coast, out into the open Atlantic where the reefs could not reach him, rounded the Cape, and came back. He found calm water. He found a desert shore. He found wild roses growing in the sand. He brought them back to Sagres as proof. Beyond Bojador, the coast opened. The expeditions pushed further south each year, advancing at roughly 1 degree of latitude annually. Methodical, cumulative, funded by the revenues of the Order of Christ and the 20% tax Henry collected on every cargo his captains brought home. Gold dust began arriving from West Africa in the mid-1440s, small quantities at first, but enough to start minting the cruzado, Portugal's gold coin, and to silence the critics who had called the enterprise a waste. It was also in the 1440s that the slave trade began in earnest, not as an accident of exploration, but as a deliberate alternative revenue stream when the gold was slow to arrive. In 1441, Antão Gonçalves and Nuno Tristão returned from the West African coast with enslaved Africans taken by force near the Rio de Ouro. In 1444, a larger raid brought approximately 240 captives to the port of Lagos, where they were publicly divided and sold. Henry took his fifth as Lord of the Enterprise and watched the proceedings from horseback. The chronicler Zurara recorded the scene in detail: families separated, people crying out in a language no one present understood. Henry watched and said nothing. The enterprise was profitable. The raids continued. Thus, by the time Henry died in November 1460, the Portuguese had explored the African coast as far south as present-day Sierra Leone, colonized Madeira, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands, established the first permanent African trading post at Arguin, and laid the navigational and institutional foundations for everything that followed. He had not found a route to India. He had not reached the Cape of Good Hope. He had not made contact with Prester John or encircled the Islamic world. But he had built a machine, a method, a culture, and a treasury of accumulated knowledge that his successors would drive to its logical conclusion. The route to India was now a question of time and nerve, not possibility. Henry was buried at the Batala Monastery in central Portugal. His motto, inscribed on his tomb, read, "Talent de bien faire," the desire to do good things well. It is the kind of epitaph a man writes for himself. The ledger of what he actually built looks rather different, a network of exploration, extraction, and forced labor that stretched down the African coast and would eventually reach across 4 continents. Both things are true of the same man, and the Portuguese Empire that grew from his work carries the same contradiction in every generation that follows. When the Portuguese first landed on Madeira in 1420, they found an uninhabited island covered in dense laurel forest, with volcanic soil of extraordinary richness and a climate mild enough to grow almost anything. The settlers who followed burned the forest to clear the land, fires that by some accounts burned for years, and began planting wheat for subsistence. Now, within a generation, the island's potential was obvious to anyone paying attention. The soil and the rainfall could produce far more than a farming community needed to eat. The question was, what to grow, who would grow it, and who would profit? Sugarcane was the answer. Cuttings arrived from Sicily in the early 1440s, brought by specialists who understood the crop's requirements. Genoese merchant bankers who had been financing Mediterranean sugar operations for generations and were eager to bypass the Venetian trading monopoly provided the capital. Sicilian and Cypriot advisors provided the technical knowledge. The Portuguese crown provided the land grants, parceling the island into captaincies, distributing estates to noble settlers on the condition that they be cleared and planted. The infrastructure of a plantation economy assembled itself with remarkable speed once the incentive structure was in place. Sugar required labor on a scale that the small settler population of Madeira could not supply. The solution was already being developed on the African coast, where Portuguese raiding parties had been taking captives since the early 1440s. From around 1450, enslaved Africans began arriving in Madeira in increasing numbers, imported specifically to work the cane fields and the processing mills. By the end of the 15th century, they represented approximately 10% of the island's total population. They cleared the land, dug, and maintained the elaborate irrigation channels known as levadas, hazardous work carved into sheer volcanic hillsides, and fed the furnaces of the sugar mills. The small Portuguese administrative class managed the operation from above. By the 1480s, 70 ships were making regular runs between Madeira and Antwerp, carrying sugar north to the refineries that distributed it across northern Europe. By the 1490s, Madeira had overtaken Cyprus as the world's largest sugar producer. The revenues flowed back to Portugal, to the Genoese investors, and to the crown. The island that had been uninhabited forest within living memory was now the center of the most productive agricultural enterprise in the Atlantic world, and its entire output rested on a captive workforce sourced from West Africa. The model that Madeira established was not accidental. It was a template, and the Portuguese recognized it as one. A small administrative class, distant from the metropole, managing a large coerced labor force to extract a single high-value commodity for export. The crown taxed the output without bearing the operational costs. The investors took their returns. The labor cost almost nothing because the workers had no choice. Every component of this system, the captaincy structure, the Genoese finance, the African labor supply, the single export crop, would be reproduced at larger and larger scale across the next century and a half. São Tomé, colonized from the 1480s in the Gulf of Guinea, ran the same model with a larger enslaved workforce and a more direct line to the West African coast. By the early 16th century, it had 50 mills and roughly 3,000 enslaved workers. When Madeira's sugar output collapsed in the 1520s, the forests exhausted, the soil depleted, the crop yields falling, the Genoese bankers simply moved their capital and their expertise to São Tomé, and then eventually to Brazil. The plantation system did not depend on any particular piece of land. It depended on the logic, captive labor, distant extraction, and a commodity that European markets would always buy. That logic was perfectly portable. After Henry's death in 1460, the momentum he had built did not stop. It had its own logic now. Every voyage south produced new knowledge, and new knowledge made the next voyage possible. King Alfonso V leased the Guinea trade to a Lisbon merchant named Fernão Gomes in 1469, granting him exclusive rights to the West African coast on the condition that he extend the known coastline by at least 100 leagues per year. And it was a commercial arrangement dressed as exploration, and it worked. Within a decade, Gomes's captains had reached the Gulf of Guinea, crossed the equator, and found gold in quantities that made everyone who had doubted the enterprise fall quiet. The Padrao was the instrument of that expansion, a limestone pillar pre-carved in Portugal and carried in the hold of every caravel, inscribed with the royal coat of arms, the cross of the Order of Christ, and the name of the reigning king. When a captain made a significant landfall, he went ashore and planted one. It was a legal act as much as a symbolic one, a formal claim entered into the record of discovery, legible to any European rival who came after. As the Portuguese pushed further south through the 1470s and 1480s, the Padraos followed at the mouth of the Congo River, now at Cape Cross in present-day Namibia, at the turning points where the coast began to curve toward the Indian Ocean. They marked a coastline being claimed mile by mile for the Portuguese crown. King John II came to the throne in 1481 and immediately moved the enterprise onto a more aggressive footing. Where Henry had funded exploration from the revenues of the Order of Christ and private investors, John II treated the Africa project as a direct instrument of his state. His first act was to commission the construction of a permanent fortress on the Gold Coast, at a place the Portuguese called a mina, the mine. 10 caravels and 2 transport ships left Lisbon in December 1481 under the command of Diogo de Azambuja, carrying 600 men and all the pre-cut stone needed to build a fortified trading post from the ground up. But they arrived at Elmina in January 1482 and began construction the following morning. The local ruler, a man the Portuguese called Caramansa, had not agreed to this. He tolerated the initial trading visits, but resisted a permanent structure. Azambuja negotiated, offered gifts, and when negotiations stalled, made the alternative sufficiently clear. Construction proceeded. The workers demolished homes to clear the building site, quarried a rock the local population held as sacred, and raised the first European fortress south of the Sahara in a matter of months. Elmina was rectangular, cornered with rounded turrets in the style of a Crusader castle, positioned on a promontory between the sea and the Benya Lagoon, where it commanded the entire harbor. From the moment it was completed, no ship could approach the Gold Coast without passing within range of its guns. The gold trade that flowed through Elmina was substantial. Portuguese ships arrived carrying cloth, brass goods, glass beads, wine, and iron, goods that had value in West African markets, and left with gold dust that went directly to the Lisbon Mint. The crown kept its 20%, and the traders kept the rest. It was a profitable and relatively orderly system, and it generated enough revenue to fund the continuing push south toward the Cape. What it also generated increasingly was a parallel economy and enslaved people. By 1500, a ship carrying between 100 and 120 enslaved Africans was leaving the island of São Tomé for Elmina roughly every 30 days. Not bound for Europe or the Americas yet, but traded internally along the West African coast, exchanged for gold with interior merchants who needed labor for their own operations. The Portuguese sat at the center of this network and took their cut at every junction. The pattern that repeated itself at every point along the coast was the same. A caravel arrived, gifts were offered, a trading relationship was proposed. If the local ruler was receptive, a feitoria, a fortified trading post, was established on a piece of land obtained by negotiation or coercion. If the ruler was hostile, or if a rival European ship was seen in the area, the situation was resolved with cannon fire. The Portuguese did not have the manpower to occupy the interior. They never tried. What they needed was the coastline, the harbors, the river mouths, and the anchorages where the products of the interior funneled toward the sea. Control the water, and you controlled the trade without needing to control the land behind it. This was the operating principle of the Africa Project, and it would become the operating principle of everything that followed. By the mid-1480s, the Portuguese had explored the African coast as far south as present-day Namibia, further than any European had gone, further than any reliable map showed. Diogo Cao had reached Cape Cross in 1486 and planted his final padrao there, roughly 1,400 kilometers beyond the Congo. The coast still curved south. The Cape of Good Hope remained unrounded. India remained unreached, but the machine that would get there was now fully operational. The caravels, the Vitorias, the accumulated navigational knowledge, and the financial infrastructure, and the institutional discipline to push 1 degree further south with every season. All that was needed was a captain willing to swing wide of the coast, trust the winds, and keep going long past the point where any rational sailor would have turned back. That captain was already being prepared. In 1482, a young nobleman who had been a part of the Elmina expedition and who had sailed repeatedly on the Guinea coast was beginning to make a name for himself in the service of King John II. His name was Bartholomew Dias. Within 5 years, John II would hand him 3 ships, a set of pre-carved padrones, and an instruction to go as far south as the coast of Africa extended. Whatever was down there, Dias was to find it. In the 15th century, spice was not a luxury in the modern sense, something pleasant but dispensable. It was a necessity of the European economy, woven into medicine, food preservation, religious ritual, and the social performance of wealth. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger arrived in European markets in quantities that sustained entire industries, and their price reflected the distance they had traveled and the number of hands they had passed through. A sack of pepper that left the Malabar coast of India worth 1 ducat would arrive in a Venetian warehouse worth 80. Every hand along the route took its cut. The final buyer in London or Bruges or Cologne paid for all of them. The route that spice traveled to reach Europe was ancient, complex, and entirely controlled by others. Merchants from Gujarat and the Malabar coast carried it by sea to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Arab traders moved it north to Cairo and Damascus. The Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who governed the critical junction where the Red Sea trade met the Mediterranean, taxed it at the point of transfer, a tariff that by the 15th century amounted to roughly 1/3 of the cargo's value. From Egypt, Venetian galleys carried it north across the Mediterranean and distributed it to the markets of Europe. At every stage, the price rose. At no stage did any of the revenue return to the people who grew the crop. Venice had built its entire civilization on this arrangement. By the mid-15th century, it was the wealthiest city-state in Europe. Its palaces, its art, its naval arsenal, and its political stability, all financed by the commission it collected on goods it had not produced and could not source independently. The Venetian relationship with the Mamluk Sultanate was formalized through treaties and maintained through generations of diplomacy. Venetian merchants lived permanently in Alexandria and Cairo. The longest reigning Doge of Venice, Francesco Foscari, had been born in Mamluk Egypt. The monopoly was not an accident of geography. It was a carefully constructed and zealously maintained political architecture. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 did not immediately destroy this system. That is, a simplification that later generations found convenient. The overland routes still functioned. Venice still collected its margins. But it created a new and more dangerous variable. an Ottoman Empire that now controlled the western terminus of the overland trade and understood perfectly well that the revenues flowing through it were a source of strategic power. The Ottomans were not hostile to trade. They were hostile to trade that enriched their rivals more than it enriched them. Managing that tension, keeping the spice flowing while extracting maximum revenue, became one of the central preoccupations of Ottoman foreign policy for the next century. What Portugal saw from its position on the Atlantic edge of Europe was the structure of the problem with unusual clarity. The overland spice route was not simply expensive. It was a toll road owned by people who had every incentive to raise the toll whenever the traffic increased. And every ducat that flowed into Mamluk Cairo and Venetian warehouses was a ducat that did not flow into Lisbon, into Bruges, into Antwerp, into any of the northern Atlantic economies that were growing rapidly but remained dependent on Mediterranean middlemen for the goods that made wealth visible. The question was not whether the monopoly could be broken. The question was whether anyone had the navigational capacity to find an alternative route and the military capacity to force it open once found. Portugal had been building that capacity for 60 years. The caravel, the accumulated charts of the African coast, the Feitorias, the navigational knowledge harvested voyage by voyage from the Atlantic, all of it pointed toward a single objective, not exploration for its own sake, not the satisfaction of geographical curiosity. You're a route to the source. If a Portuguese ship could reach the Malabar coast directly, bypassing Egypt, bypassing Venice, bypassing every intermediary in the chain, it could buy spice at the production price and sell it in Lisbon for a fraction of the Venetian cost and still make a fortune. The entire economic logic of the medieval world could be rerouted. All that was needed was the Cape. The Islamic world understood this threat before Portugal had fully articulated it. The Mamluk sultans, dependent on spice transit revenues for a substantial portion of their treasury, were receiving reports from Indian Ocean merchants about Portuguese ships probing further south along the African coast as early as the 1480s. The Venetians, whose entire commercial civilization rested on the Mediterranean monopoly, watched the Portuguese enterprise with growing alarm. When Vasco da Gama's ships returned to Lisbon in 1499 with their hold of pepper and cinnamon, the price of spice in Lisbon fell to less than a fifth of the price in Venice almost immediately. The alarm in Venice was not merely commercial, it was existential. An entire city had just been told that its reason for existing was no longer necessary. In August 1487, Bartholomew Dias left Lisbon with 3 ships, 2 armed caravels of roughly 50 tons each, and a supply vessel. He was a veteran of the Guinea coast, had been part of the Elmina expedition in 1481, and had spent enough time on the southern African run to know what the coast looked like past Cape Cross. Now, King John II had appointed him with a specific and daunting mandate: to go further south than any Portuguese captain had gone, find the end of the African continent, and determine whether the Indian Ocean lay beyond it. Most of the officers under his command had made the same run before. They knew what the southern latitudes meant. They went anyway. The first months were methodical. Dias followed the African coast south through the familiar waters of Angola and Namibia, passing Diogo Cao's final padrao at Cape Cross and pushing into coastline that no Portuguese chart showed. On December 8th, they put in at Walvis Bay. By December 26th, they had reached Elizabeth Bay, the coast still running south and west with no sign of turning. Somewhere beyond the 29th parallel, with adverse winds building and the temperature dropping, and Dias made a decision that would determine the course of the next century. He turned his ships away from the coast and drove south into open ocean. For 13 days, a violent storm battered the 2 caravels. The supply ship had been left behind at anchor in Namibia with a caretaker crew of 9 men. Dias and his sailors had nothing but each other and the shrieking wind. They were pushed south and west, further from Africa than any Portuguese ship had sailed, into cold seas and a sky they did not recognize. When the storm finally exhausted itself, Dias held east, searching for the coast. Nothing appeared. He turned north, On the 3rd of February 1488, after almost 30 days out of sight of land, a shoreline emerged from the haze. The water was warmer. The current ran differently. The vegetation on the shore was unlike anything they had seen on the Atlantic side. Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope without seeing it. The storm had done the work, driving the fleet so far south that the continent's tip had passed beneath them in the darkness and chaos, unwitnessed. He landed at a bay he named Angra de São Brás, present-day Mossel Bay, where Khoikhoi herders watched from the shore and then threw stones when the Portuguese came too close. Diaz pressed east, the coast curving steadily northeast, the sea growing warmer with every day. The Indian Ocean was real. The passage was open. The route that Portugal had been building toward for 70 years existed. He wanted to keep going. His officers did not. Supplies were running low. The ships were battered. Now, the men had been at sea for 6 months with nothing familiar around them. On March 12th, at Quaihook near the mouth of the Bozeman's River, Diaz planted his final padrao, the Padrão de São Gregorio, and called a council. The officers voted unanimously to turn back. Diaz agreed, but extracted from them a written declaration that the decision had been made collectively against his will. He was not going home empty-handed. He was going home with evidence. On the return voyage, sailing west along the southern coast, they finally saw it. The rocky headland at the foot of Africa, where the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean contested the same water. Diaz named it the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms. King John II, when he heard the report, renamed it the Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope. It was a political decision as much as a geographical one. The king needed investors as sailors, and the court's continued appetite for the enterprise. A Cape of Good Hope sold that better than a Cape of Storms. Both names were accurate. The Cape was, in equal measure, the most dangerous stretch of water in the known world and the gateway to everything Portugal had been reaching for. Diaz returned to Lisbon in December 1488 after 16 months and 17 days at sea. He had explored more than 2,000 kilometers of previously uncharted African coastline and proved that the southern tip of Africa could be rounded. His reception at court was notably subdued. John II was already planning a grander expedition, one that would go all the way to India, and Diaz was set to work supervising the construction of the ships that Vasco da Gama would command. He would never lead another major voyage. 12 years later, sailing as a captain under Pedro Alvarez Cabral, he died where his greatest discovery had been made. Lost in a storm off the Cape of Storms in May of 1500, the cape that bore his name in everything but title, swallowing him at last. On the 3rd of March, 1493, a battered caravel limped into the harbor at Restelo, near Lisbon, carrying a Genoese navigator under a Spanish flag and news that changed everything. Christopher Columbus had crossed the Atlantic, reached land on the other side, and claimed it for the Spanish crown. Thus he had not found Asia, though he believed until his death that he had. But what he had found was enough to set the two Iberian powers on a collision course. Portugal had spent 70 years and an enormous amount of money building toward a monopoly on the sea route east. Spain had just announced that it intended to reach the same destination from the other direction. King John II of Portugal was not passive about this. He had his own legal basis for claiming Columbus's discoveries. Earlier papal bulls had granted Portugal rights over Atlantic exploration, and he began assembling a fleet to enforce that claim by force if necessary. Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, moved faster. They went directly to Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard, and born Rodrigo Borgia in Aragon, and extracted 3 papal bulls in rapid succession through 1493, each one drawing a line of demarcation in the Atlantic and granting everything west of it to Castile. The papal process was not mediation. It was Spanish foreign policy conducted through the Church. John II refused to accept the papal line. He understood with considerable geographical precision that the line as drawn left Portugal insufficient room to maneuver its ships around the African coast without violating Spanish waters. And possibly, given what his captains already suspected about the South Atlantic, cut off Portugal's access to a large territory lying to the west of the African route. He demanded direct negotiations. The two crowns met at the Castilian town of Tordesillas in the spring of 1494. And on the 7th of June, they signed a treaty that moved the line of demarcation from 100 leagues west of Cape Verde to 370 leagues west, a shift of roughly 1,200 kilometers out into the Atlantic. The Spanish diplomats accepted this without fully understanding why Portugal wanted it. The reasons became clear 6 years later, when Cabral's fleet, sailing the wide arc of the South Atlantic en route to India, made landfall on a coast that lay unmistakably east of the Tordesillas line. Brazil was Portuguese, and almost certainly Portugal's negotiators in 1494 had known from the accumulated intelligence of their Atlantic voyages that land existed out there. The 370-league shift was not a cartographic preference. It was a land grab executed through treaty before the land had been officially found. The treaty divided the world between two nations without asking anyone else's permission and without consulting the millions of people who lived in the territories it disposed of. France, England, and the Netherlands never accepted its terms. The French king, Francis I, was said to have demanded to see the clause in Adam's will that divided the world between Spain and Portugal. In practical terms, however, the treaty achieved its purpose for Portugal. It cleared the diplomatic space east of the line, confirmed Portugal's monopoly on the African route and the Indian Ocean beyond it, and gave the crown the legal architecture to treat any rival ship in those waters as a trespasser. The cartaz system, the licensing regime that would make every merchant in the Indian Ocean pay Portugal for the right to sail, rested on this foundation. Tordesillas did not just divide the world. It gave Portugal the legal authority to tax it. Vasco da Gama was not an obvious choice to command the most consequential maritime expedition in Portuguese history. He was a minor nobleman from the coastal town of Sines, competent, mathematically skilled, experienced enough with navigation. But not a celebrated captain, not a veteran of multiple long voyages, not the most senior man available. King Manuel I chose him in 1497 for reasons that were partly political and partly temperamental. Da Gama was loyal to the crown, had demonstrated useful aggression in an earlier mission seizing French ships, and possessed the kind of cold, the coercive will that Manuel had decided this voyage was going to require. The exploratory phase was over. The commercial phase needed a different kind of man. He left Lisbon on the 8th of July, 1497, with 4 ships and a crew of approximately 170 men. 2 were newly built carracks, the São Gabriel, which da Gama commanded, and the São Rafael under his brother Paulo, a caravel named the Barrio, and a supply vessel. The fleet carried interpreters in Arabic and several Bantu dialects, letters from the king in Arabic for the rulers he expected to meet, padrones to plant as territorial markers, and gifts intended for Indian royalty. The gifts were the first sign that someone in Lisbon had not thought carefully enough. They were the kind of modest goods, striped cloth, coral beads, and a few hats that worked reasonably well on the West African coast. For the sophisticated courts of the Malabar, they would prove an embarrassment. The route south was now well understood. Da Gama followed the African coast to Sierra Leone, then executed the long counterclockwise arc into the South Atlantic that Diaz had pioneered, swinging far west of Africa to pick up the westerly winds that would carry the fleet around the Cape. The maneuver worked. For 93 days, the longest open ocean passage ever completed to that point, the 4 ships sailed without sight of land. On the 4th of November 1497, the African coast reappeared at St. Helena Bay in present-day South Africa. The Cape of Good Hope was rounded on November 22nd. They were in the Indian Ocean. Diaz had proved it was possible. Da Gama was now proving it could be done on a schedule with a loaded fleet in a direction that could be repeated. The East African coast was a revelation and an immediate problem. Mozambique, Mombasa, Malindi, these were not primitive settlements. They were wealthy, sophisticated trading cities connected by centuries of commerce to Arabia, Persia, and India. Their harbors held Gujarati merchants, Arab dhows, and goods from half a world away. When Da Gama arrived presenting himself as a trading emissary from a great king, the local rulers assessed his ships, looked at his cargo, and formed a conclusion that was largely accurate. These men were poorly equipped newcomers of uncertain intent who were pretending to be more than they were. The Sultan of Mozambique, initially thinking the Portuguese were Muslim merchants, extended hospitality. When he understood they were Christians, he withdrew it. At Mombasa, the reception was openly hostile. At Malindi, further north, the king was cordial, partly because the Portuguese were useful as a counterweight against Mombasa, his rival. At Malindi, Da Gama obtained what he needed most, a pilot who knew the Indian Ocean. The man was almost certainly a Gujarati Muslim named Ahmad ibn Majid, one of the most accomplished navigators then alive, a man who had written technical treatises on Indian Ocean navigation and who understood the monsoon system as intimately as any sailor of his generation. With Ibn Majid at the helm and the southwest monsoon behind them, the fleet crossed the Indian Ocean in 23 days, a run that would have taken months by any other route. On the 20th of May, 1498, the mountains of the western Ghats appeared on the horizon. Calicut lay just ahead. Calicut in 1498 was one of the great trading cities of the world. Its harbor held ships from Arabia, Persia, East Africa, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Its spice market set the regional price for pepper, ginger, and cinnamon. Its ruler, the Zamorin, the hereditary lord of the sea, governed an open port on the principle that trade flowed best when it was undisturbed, and had maintained that principle for generations. The Muslim merchant community of Calicut, wealthy and well-connected, had built its position over centuries of reliable commerce. When Da Gama's 4 battered ships appeared off the Malabar coast and announced themselves as representatives of the King of Portugal, the city was curious, cautious, and entirely unimpressed. The meeting with the Zamorin was a catalogue of misreadings. Da Gama and his men, steeped in the crusading theology of the Reconquista, entered a Hindu temple and convinced themselves it was a Christian church. The strange figures on the walls were saints. The altar was a shrine to the Virgin Mary. The Zamorin received them with formal courtesy and then asked directly what they had come for. Da Gama's answer, that he had come in search of Christians and spices, landed in the court of one of the wealthiest Hindu rulers in India as a statement that was baffling on the first count and inadequate on the second. When the gifts were presented, the Zamorin's advisors laughed. The poorest Arab merchant in the harbor had brought better offerings. Trade negotiations dragged through July and into August were complicated at every turn by the Muslim merchant community, which understood perfectly well what Portuguese access to the Malabar spice trade would mean for their own position. Da Gama grew increasingly paranoid and increasingly aggressive. He seized Indian hostages to ensure the return of men he had sent ashore. He left without paying the port duties. He abducted several Nair fishermen on his way out of the harbor. By the time he set sail on the 29th of August 1498, the Zamorin of Calicut, who had received him with genuine openness, had been given every reason to regard the Portuguese as dangerous and untrustworthy pirates. The return voyage was a catastrophe. Sailing against the monsoon without understanding its seasonal rhythm, as the fleet took nearly 3 months to cross an ocean it had crossed in 23 days on the outbound leg, scurvy consumed the crew. Men died in their berths, their gums swollen over their teeth, unable to eat. At one point, there were so few healthy sailors left that Da Gama considered burning one of the ships because no one was left to sail it. The São Rafael was eventually scuttled off the East African coast to allow its crew to be distributed across the remaining vessels. Of the 170 men who had left Lisbon, approximately 55 returned. The fleet arrived back in Portugal in stages through the summer of 1499. The Barrio reached Lisbon in July. Da Gama followed in September, delayed because his brother Paulo was dying of tuberculosis and he had refused to leave him. Paulo died in the Azores. Da Gama arrived in Lisbon alone, having buried one brother, and returned to a reception that treated the voyage as a triumph. King Manuel rewarded him lavishly. The spices in the hold, a modest cargo purchased at inflated prices, sold in Lisbon for roughly 3,000% profit over their cost. The route worked. The margin was real. That the mission had nearly destroyed itself through diplomatic ineptitude, poor timing, and a death toll above 60% was noted and set aside. A second, much larger fleet was already being assembled. This time, it would go properly armed, and this time, there would be no pretense that it was a trading mission. The fleet that left Lisbon on the 9th of March 1500 was a statement of intent. 13 ships, approximately 1,400 men, 600 of them soldiers. Where Da Gama's 4 vessels had been an exploratory probe, this was an armada, funded by the Portuguese crown, co-financed by Florentine bankers Bartholomew Marchionni and Girolamo Cernigi, and equipped for a mission that everyone in Lisbon understood was no longer primarily about diplomacy. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, a nobleman of the royal household with more military than nautical experience, commanded it. He was chosen for the same reason Da Gama had been chosen, not for what he knew about the sea, but for what he was prepared to do when he got there. Bartholomew Dias, who had rounded the Cape 12 years earlier, sailed as captain of one of the vessels. Following Da Gama's advice, Cabral swung the fleet far west into the South Atlantic to pick up the favorable winds for the Cape. On the 22nd of April 1500, after weeks at sea, the lookout spotted a mountain rising from the horizon. The land was lush, inhabited, and entirely unknown to the fleet's charts. Cabral sent men ashore, found the local Tupiniquim people receptive and peaceful, held a mass on the beach, and dispatched a supply ship back to Lisbon to report the discovery. He named it Ilha de Vera Cruz, the Island of the True Cross. It was not an island, it was South America, and it fell east of the Tordesillas line, which meant it belonged to Portugal. A week later, Cabral resumed course for India. Brazil would wait. The Cape of Good Hope destroyed him on the way through. On the 29th of May, a violent storm struck the fleet rounding the Cape and sank 4 ships within hours. All hands were lost on each of them. Bartholomew Dias, who had named that stretch of water the Cape of Storms and been overruled, died where he had made his greatest discovery, swallowed by the same waters he had been the first European to navigate. Of the 13 ships that left Lisbon, 7 reached the Indian Ocean. The survivors pressed on. At Calicut in September, the mission began well. The new Zamorin, the old one had died, was more commercially inclined than his predecessor, and granted Cabral permission to establish a trading post and warehouse in the city. Cabral negotiated carefully, loaded some cargo, and waited for more. The Muslim merchant community of Calicut watched the Portuguese trading post go up and understood what it represented. A permanent competitor with royal backing, intent on breaking the commercial network they had spent generations building. On the 16th of December 1500, a crowd of several hundred attacked the post and killed more than 50 Portuguese, including the chief factor Aires Correa. The warehouse burned. The survivors swam to the ships. Cabral waited 24 hours for the Zamorin to respond with an explanation and an apology. None came. The Zamorin was caught between factions he could not control and gave no answer because he had no answer that would satisfy both sides. His silence was, for Cabral, a declaration of complicity. The Portuguese response was systematic. 10 Arab merchant ships at anchor in Calicut harbor were seized, their cargoes confiscated, and their crews, approximately 600 men, killed. The ships were then burned. The following day, Cabral ordered a full naval bombardment of the city, sustained for an entire day. It was targeting the harbor, the warehouses, and the residential areas along the waterfront. The unfortified city had no effective answer to naval artillery. Cabral then sailed south to Cochin, where the local ruler, a vassal of the Zamorin who had been looking for an opportunity to break free, welcomed the Portuguese with open arms. A treaty of alliance was negotiated, a trading post established, and the ships loaded with spice. Cochin became what Calicut had refused to be, Portugal's foothold on the Malabar coast. The political fractures within the Indian city-state system, the rivalries, the vassal resentments, the competing commercial interests, were now a resource that Portugal knew how to use. The fleet left India in January 1501 and arrived back in Lisbon in stages through the summer. Of 13 ships departed, the 5 returned with cargo. The human losses were severe. The diplomatic mission had failed entirely. Calicut was now an open enemy. And yet, King Manuel declared the voyage a success because the spices sold for profits that dwarfed every loss. The financial logic was merciless in its clarity. The dead were a cost, the spices were revenue, and the revenue was larger. A third armada was already being planned before the last survivors of the second had finished unloading. The lesson that Lisbon took from Cabral's voyage was not that the approach needed to change. It was that the force applied had been insufficient. The trading post at Calicut had been destroyed because it was too exposed and too lightly defended. The answer was more ships, heavier armament, one and a commander who would not wait 24 hours for an answer that was never going to come. The man they chose for the Third Armada was the one who had opened this enterprise 9 years earlier. Vasco da Gama was going back to India, not as an explorer, not as a diplomat, but as an admiral with explicit orders to extract vengeance and force submission by any means available. Before he sailed, one further thing had been settled in Lisbon: the cartaz system, a licensing regime requiring every merchant vessel in the Indian Ocean to purchase a Portuguese pass or face seizure and destruction, was now policy. It had been conceived during da Gama's first voyage and refined in the aftermath of Cabral's failure. It would be formalized and enforced on the next voyage. Every ship on the Indian Ocean, regardless of flag or cargo or destination, would either pay Portugal for the right to sail or be treated as a legitimate target. The choke point strategy, which had failed at Ceuta a century earlier because Portugal had not controlled the routes feeding the city, was being rebuilt at oceanic scale. This time, Portugal intended to control the water itself. On the 12th of February 1502, Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 20 warships and approximately 800 men. King Manuel had given him a new title, Admiral of the Seas of Arabia, Persia, India, and all the Orient, and a set of instructions that left little ambiguity about the nature of the mission. This was not an expedition of commerce or diplomacy. It was a punitive operation. The trading post at Calicut had been burned. 50 Portuguese were dead, wherein the Zamorin had declined to apologize. Da Gama was going back to collect the debt, and he had been given enough firepower to collect it on his own terms. The Fourth Armada was, in the words of those who sailed on it, a revenge fleet. The fleet was also, in a precise sense, a family enterprise. Da Gama commanded the first squadron of 10 ships. His cousin Estevão da Gama led a second squadron of 5, which departed separately in April and joined the main fleet in the Indian Ocean. His maternal uncles Vicente and Bras Sodré commanded a patrol flotilla with standing orders to remain in Indian waters after the main fleet returned home, the first permanent Portuguese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Brothers-in-law filled out the captaincies of the remaining vessels. Vasco da Gama had spent the years since his first voyage cultivating influence at court. He was now deploying it to ensure that the mission's rewards, whatever they turned out to be, flowed to people he trusted. The East African coast was the first target. At Sofala, a gold trading port in present-day Mozambique, the Armada established contact and began purchasing gold in quantities that confirmed everything the earlier voyages had suggested about East African wealth. At Kilwa, the prosperous Swahili Sultanate, whose ruler had previously refused a Portuguese audience, da Gama sailed directly into the harbor with his entire fleet, trained his guns on the Sultan's waterfront palace, and delivered an ultimatum. The Sultan of Kilwa would swear personal loyalty to King Manuel, pay an annual tribute in gold, and fly the Portuguese flag from his highest tower. The Sultan agreed. The gold extracted from Kilwa that season was eventually sent back to Lisbon, where the royal goldsmith Gil Vicente used it to make the Custodia de Belém, a jeweled monstrance that still sits in the treasury of the Jerónimos Monastery, one of the finest pieces of goldwork in Portuguese history, built from extortion. In the Indian Ocean, between the African coast and Calicut, da Gama intercepted the Miri, a large merchant vessel returning from the Hajj at Mecca, carrying approximately 380 passengers, including merchants, pilgrims, women, and children. The ship's cargo was seized. The passengers were locked in the holds. Da Gama ordered the ship burned. The passengers broke through the hatches and fought back for 5 days with stones, arrows, as in bare hands. The men and women of the Miri, trapped on a dying ship in open ocean, refusing to go quietly. On the 5th day, a Portuguese vessel grappled alongside and finished the work. Almost all 380 people on board were dead by the time the Miri went under. A Flemish sailor who witnessed it wrote that he could not eat for days afterward. Da Gama expressed no recorded regret. The strategic logic of the Miri burning, if logic is the right word for it, was terror. Da Gama understood that he could not occupy the Indian Ocean with 20 ships. He could not garrison every port, patrol every route, or physically intercept every merchant vessel operating across 30 million square kilometers of water. What he could do was make the cost of ignoring Portuguese authority so visceral and so total that no ruler on the Malabar coast would risk it. The Miri was a message, delivered in a language that required no interpreter. Every merchant from Calicut to Hormuz heard it within weeks. At Calicut, da Gama bombarded the city for 2 full days, hanged 38 fishermen from his yardarms in full view of the shore, and cut off their hands, feet, and heads, loading the dismembered remains onto a boat with a note addressed to the Zamorin, suggesting he make a curry of them. He then defeated a combined Calicut and Arab privateer fleet of roughly 160 vessels in a battle off the harbor. Using the line-ahead formation, one of the earliest recorded uses of that tactic in naval history, to bring his broadsides to bear simultaneously. The Zamorin's fleet was destroyed. Calicut's trade was brought to a standstill. The city was not captured because da Gama did not have the troops to hold it. He did not need to hold it. He needed it to stop functioning, and it did. The cartaz system was formalized on this voyage as an operational policy. Every merchant vessel wishing to trade along the Malabar coast was required to purchase a Portuguese pass, call only at Portuguese-controlled or Portuguese-approved ports, and carry no goods, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, that Portugal had designated as its exclusive trade. Ships found without a cartaz were seized. Their cargo was confiscated. Their crews faced whatever consequences the boarding party chose to apply. The system was not presented as piracy. It was presented as regulation, the administrative expression of Portugal's claim, rooted in papal authority and the Treaty of Tordesillas, to govern the waters of the Indian Ocean as sovereign territory. The merchants who paid the cartaz tax were not being robbed. They were, in the official Portuguese accounting, being protected. Da Gama left India in February 1503 with his ships loaded with spice and a strategic situation that was, by any honest measure, unresolved. Calicut was broken but not submitted. The Zamorin was humiliated but not conquered. The factories at Cochin and Cananor were functional but vulnerable. His uncles Vicente and Bras Sodre, left behind to patrol the coast, abandoned their post almost immediately to raid Arab shipping in the Red Sea and were both lost in a storm, a failure of discipline that nearly cost Portugal its entire Indian foothold when the Zamorin promptly marched on Cochin. Da Gama arrived back in Lisbon in September 1503. He had terrorized half the Indian Ocean, formalized a monopoly licensing system, and returned with enough spice to satisfy the investors. He had not broken the Zamorin. A new and more systematic mind would be required to finish the job. In late January 1504, Afonso de Albuquerque's Fifth Armada loaded its final cargo of spice at Cochin and made ready to sail home. Before departing, Albuquerque made a decision that was either an act of confidence or a calculated gamble, depending on how the next few months unfolded. He left behind 150 Portuguese soldiers, 1 carrack, and 2 caravels to hold the city. He placed them under the command of a knight named Duarte Pacheco Pereira, a man of about 44 years who had spent his adult life between the African coast, the court of King John II, and the sea routes of the Atlantic. Pacheco was not a famous commander. He was about to become one. The Zamorin of Calicut had been watching the Portuguese entrench themselves at Cochin for 3 years. He had seen his fleet destroyed twice, his city bombarded, his trade strangled, and his authority over the Malabar city-states eroding with every Portuguese alliance concluded in his territory. The alliance between the Trimumpara Raja of Cochin and the Portuguese was particularly intolerable. A vassal of Calicut sheltering the Europeans and profiting from their trade, while the Zamorin absorbed the costs of their aggression. When Albuquerque's armada disappeared over the horizon, the Zamorin assembled everything he had. His army numbered somewhere between 57,000 and 84,000 men. He had 250 vessels, nearly 300 smaller Indian guns, and 5 large European-style cannon, cast by 2 Venetian engineers who had come specifically to help him destroy Portuguese ships. He marched in March 1504. Pacheco had been preparing since the moment Albuquerque left. He was one of the most scientifically literate men in Portugal, a cartographer, a mathematician, and almost certainly the first European to establish a predictive relationship between the phases of the moon and the movement of the tides. At Cochin, that knowledge was not academic. The city sat on a peninsula surrounded by lagoons, waterways, and tidal channels. There were a limited number of fords where an army could cross from the mainland to the city, and those fords were navigable only at certain states of the tide. Pacheco mapped every one of them, calculated the tidal windows for each crossing point, and built his entire defensive strategy around the fact that he knew when and where the Zamorin's army could move, and when and where it could not. He planted sharpened stakes in the lagoon beds at the main crossing points, calibrated to impale a man at mid-tide. He constructed wooden stockades at the fords. He positioned his carrack to cover the harbor entrance and assigned his 2 caravels, lighter, faster, easier to maneuver in the shallow channels, to the ford at Cabral, where the first attack was expected. He told his gunners what to do and when to do it. He positioned 39 men at Fort Manuel and distributed the remaining soldiers across the waterway crossing points. Then, he waited with the arithmetic certainty of a man who has done his calculations and trusts them. The Zamorin arrived at the ford of Cabral on the 31st of March. His advance force waded into the lagoon and immediately slowed. The stakes in the mud caught feet, the water dragged at armor, and the narrow ford compressed tens of thousands of men into a bottleneck that Pacheco's caravels had been waiting for. Then Portuguese gunfire opened on the column at close range. The Zamorin brought up his Venetian cannon to answer. Pacheco's marksmen targeted the gun crews specifically, dispersing them before they could find their range. The first assault ended with several hundred Calicut dead and the ford uncrossed. Over the following weeks, the Zamorin tested every approach. He tried feints, a naval diversionary attack on the harbor to draw the caravels away while infantry crossed the northern ford. Pacheco recognized the pattern, split his ships to cover both points simultaneously, and destroyed both prongs. He tried floating fighting platforms, large rafts with reinforced walls and elevated towers, drifting with the high tide toward the Portuguese positions. Pacheco concentrated all available fire on a single platform until its structural integrity failed, watched it drag on the bottom and stop, then repeated the process on the next one until every floating fortress was grounded in the mud. When the tide went out, his men boarded the stranded platforms and burned them. In late April, a cholera epidemic broke out in the Zamorin's encampment. Within a week, it had killed more than 10,000 men. The Zamorin pressed on. On the 7th of May, he launched his largest assault, a three-wave attack of roughly 39,000 men at the northern ford, timed precisely to the low tide. The first wave slowed on the stakes and was met with cannon fire. The second wave arrived on schedule and compressed into the first, adding to the crush. The third wave followed with engineers to demolish the stockades. Pacheco's gunners worked methodically through the mass of men, and the ford held. The Zamorin came within, as one account puts it, a hair's breadth of breaking through. He did not break through. By late June, the Zamorin had exhausted his operational options. His army was reduced by combat losses, disease, and desertion. His fleet had been destroyed or driven off in engagement after engagement. His Venetian cannon were gone. Pacheco's men had sailed up to them during a feigned ammunition shortage that drew the guns out of their protective earthworks, then destroyed them at close range when they were exposed. The city of Cochin was intact. Fort Manuel still flew the Portuguese flag. On the 24th of June, when the Zamorin abdicated his throne in favor of his nephew and withdrew his army northward. On the 3rd of July, 1504, the Battle of Cochin was over. The 6th Armada arrived in September 1504 and found not the ruins of a fallen garrison, but a functioning Portuguese fort, a loyal allied king, and a Malabar coast that had just watched the Zamorin, the most powerful ruler on the western coast of India, failed to destroy 150 men over 5 months. The strategic effect was permanent. Every city-state on the Malabar coast recalculated its position. Portuguese authority in India, which had been a threat in early 1504, was now a fact. Pacheco returned to Lisbon in 1505 to a hero's welcome. Public celebrations, royal honors. The poet Camões would later call him the Portuguese Achilles. He spent the next years writing his navigational treatise, the Esmeralda de Situ Orbis, a work so detailed and so sensitive that it was never published in his lifetime and would not appear in print until 1892. It contained too much of what Portugal needed to keep secret. In the end, the court that had celebrated him turned on him. He was falsely accused of corruption while governing Elmina, briefly imprisoned, exonerated, and released. But his influence was gone, his wealth stripped, and his king's gratitude exhausted. He died in obscurity in 1533. The empire he had saved went on without him. Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in the Indian Ocean in 1506, already knowing what he intended to do. He was 53 years old, a veteran of the North African campaigns. Nguyen had spent years in Lisbon presenting King Manuel I with a strategic argument that nobody before him had articulated with such precision. The Portuguese mission in Asia had been conceived as a trading enterprise enforced by naval power. Albuquerque believed this was insufficient. A trading empire sustained only by ships was temporary. It lasted as long as no rival could match the ships. A trading empire built on fortified positions at the world's critical maritime junctions was something else. It was a lock. He had come to build the lock. The 3 points Albuquerque identified were Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea, and Malacca on the strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. Between them, these 3 positions controlled every maritime route by which the wealth of Asia could reach the Mediterranean world. Hormuz commanded the Persian Gulf trade, the route through which goods flowed north to Basra, Baghdad, and ultimately to the markets of the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Aden commanded the Red Sea, the route to Cairo, Alexandria, and Venice. Malacca commanded the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, the junction through which the spice of the Moluccas, the silk of China, and the trade of all Southeast Asia was funneled westward. Close all three, and the Islamic trading world was not merely disrupted, it was strangled. Hormuz fell first, in 1507, though the initial conquest was partial and had to be completed in 1515. The island sat at the narrowest point of the Persian Gulf entrance, and whoever held it held the toll gate on the entire Gulf's commerce. Albuquerque arrived with 7 battered ships after a punishing voyage from Socotra, trained his guns on the city, and extracted submission from the young king and his vizier through a combination of artillery demonstration and a sufficiently credible threat of complete destruction. A Portuguese fortress went up on the island. The customs house passed under Portuguese administration. Every ship entering or leaving the Persian Gulf now passed under Portuguese guns and paid Portuguese duties. Goa, which Albuquerque was not originally ordered to take, was seized in 1510 on the intelligence of a local privateer named Timoji, who advised that the Sultan of Bijapur, an enemy of the Portuguese allied Hindu rulers, was assembling a fleet in the city. Albuquerque arrived with 23 ships, took the city in February, lost it to a Muslim counterattack in May, and retook it in November after 3 days of street fighting in which the Muslim defenders were killed almost to the last man. He had been given strict orders not to sack the city when he first took it. When he took it back, he applied a different standard. The Hindu and Christian population was spared. The Muslim population was not. Goa became the capital of the Estado da India, the Portuguese state of India, and remained so for 450 years. Malacca was the most audacious conquest. The city was the greatest trading port in Southeast Asia, larger than Lisbon, larger than Venice, a place where merchants from China, Java, India, Arabia, and a dozen other civilizations converged to exchange goods in a babel of languages that one Portuguese observer counted at 84. The Sultan of Malacca had been hostile to Portuguese traders since an earlier mission had gone badly, and several Portuguese factors were being held in the city under conditions that the survivors described as brutal. In April 1511, Albuquerque left Goa with approximately 1,000 Portuguese soldiers, 800 Allied troops, and 400 guns loaded onto 18 ships. It was, as one later historian noted, the farthest territorial conquest in history to that point. The assault on Malacca in July 1511 took 3 weeks. The Sultan's forces were numerically superior and included war elephants and substantial artillery. Albuquerque drove them back street by street, used Chinese and Indian merchants within the city who had their own grievances against the Sultan as intelligence sources and logistical allies. And on the 25th of July, took the bridge over the Bertam River that was the city's central spine. The Sultan fled. Albuquerque immediately ordered the construction of A Famosa, the famous, a stone fortress at the harbor entrance, built partly from the stones of the city's mosque and the graves beneath it. The strait was now Portuguese. Every ship moving between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea now sailed under Portuguese guns. Aden, the third target, was the one that got away. Albuquerque attacked it in 1513 with a force that proved insufficient. The city's fortifications were more formidable than intelligence had suggested. The assault failed to breach the walls, and the fleet withdrew. It was the single strategic failure of his tenure, and it was consequential. Without Aden, the Red Sea remained open to Arab and Ottoman shipping. Goods could still reach Egypt and Venice by the old route. The lock that Albuquerque was building had a gap in it, and he knew it. He planned a second assault on Aden for 1516. He never lived to make it. In September 1515, returning from his successful second campaign at Hormuz, Albuquerque received word that King Manuel had replaced him as governor of Portuguese India with his personal enemy. Lope Soares de Albergaria. The news arrived by ship while he was still at sea, approaching Goa. He wrote a final letter to the king, measured, precise, and bitter, noting his services, asking that his illegitimate son, Braise, be granted the honors the king had denied the father, and adding that Manuel would discover, now that he had removed him, how much he had depended on him. He died on the 16th of December 1515, still aboard his ship in the harbor of Goa, before he could go ashore. He had served the Portuguese crown for 9 years in Asia, built the architecture of its empire with his own hands, and been dismissed for the last time before his feet could touch the capital he had taken for Portugal. He was buried in Goa. His enemies at court celebrated. What Albuquerque left behind was the structural skeleton of the Portuguese Empire at its maximum extent: Hormuz, Goa, Malacca, and a network of lesser fortresses and faitorias stretching from Mozambique to the Moluccas. He had not closed the Red Sea. He had not broken the overland route entirely, but he had redirected enough of the Indian Ocean's commerce through Portuguese-controlled channels that the empire's financial logic was now self-sustaining. The spice revenues paid for the fortresses protected the spice routes, and the cartaz system taxed every ship that moved between them. The question was no longer whether the system worked. The question was whether a country of 1.5 million people could hold it. By 1515, Portugal governed, or claimed to govern, a chain of fortified positions stretching from the East African coast to the Moluccas, a distance of roughly 14,000 kilometers. The Estado da India, formally established in 1505 under the first Viceroy Francisco de Almeida, was the administrative apparatus built to manage this empire from a single capital. That capital was Goa, a natural harbor island on the Malabar coast, positioned midway along the main trading routes, deep enough for the largest carracks and defensible enough to resist the counterattacks that arrived on an almost annual basis. From the Palacio de Hidalgo, the palace of the former Bijapur Sultan, repurposed without alteration as the seat of Portuguese viceregal power, a single official theoretically administered everything from Mozambique to Macau. The viceroy moved through Goa in crimson robes beneath a brocade parasol, attended by a vast entourage, conducting the rituals of royal authority in a city that was, by the mid-16th century, genuinely wealthy and genuinely impressive. Travelers reported that a Portuguese proverb had emerged: "He who has seen Goa need not see Lisbon." The comparison was not absurd. The city's stone churches, its wide streets, its markets heaped with the goods of 4 continents, silk from China, horses from Arabia, spices from the Moluccas, gold from East Africa, gave it an opulence that outpaced anything in contemporary Portugal. The wealth of half the world had been redirected through this one harbor, and the harbor took its cut of all of it. The administrative structure beneath the viceroy was, in theory, orderly. A finance council managed customs revenues. A high court administered Portuguese law. A military registry tracked ships, soldiers, and supplies. The Casa de India in Lisbon coordinated all colonial trade and communications, maintaining the paper chain of authority between the king and his most distant officials. In practice, the distances involved made real oversight almost impossible. A letter sent from Lisbon to Goa took 6 months in good conditions. A reply took another 6. A viceroy who decided to act contrary to his instructions had a full year to do so before anyone in Portugal could respond. Most of them took advantage of this. Corruption was not an aberration in the Estado de India. It was structural. The officials posted to the Indian Ocean were overwhelmingly minor nobility, fidalgos, whose families had spent their modest wealth purchasing the court connections needed to secure an appointment. They came to the east expecting to return rich, because returning rich was the understood purpose of the posting. The crown paid poor salaries and supplemented them with allocation of cargo space on official ships, the quintiladas system, which gave every official a personal financial stake in the same trade the crown was supposedly monopolizing. Private trading, smuggling, and the systematic underreporting of customs revenues were universal. The empire ran on it. The cartaz system at full operational scale was something the Indian Ocean had never experienced. Every merchant vessel wishing to trade, Arab, Indian, Gujarati, Swahili, Malay, was required to call at a Portuguese-controlled port, purchase a pass, declare its cargo and destination, and pay the applicable duties. The pass specified which routes were permitted, which ports could be called at, and which goods were restricted. Ships found at sea without a cartaz were treated as pirates and their cargoes confiscated, their crews subject to whatever the boarding party chose. The system was enforced by a permanent patrol fleet, approximately 800 Portuguese vessels in Indian waters at the empire's peak, whose captains were financially incentivized to intercept non-compliant ships because they kept a share of every confiscation. The Goa Inquisition, established in 1560, extended the empire's coercive architecture into the religious sphere. Goa's Hindu population, which had been the majority of the city when the Portuguese arrived, faced sustained pressure to convert. Those who converted and were then found to be practicing Hindu rituals in private were subject to investigation, trial, and punishment by an inquisitorial court that operated with the same blend of institutional thoroughness and personal corruption that characterized every other branch of the Estado. Between 1561 and 1774, the Inquisition tried more than 16,000 people. The largest church in Asia, the Sé Cathedral, longer than any church in Portugal, rose in the center of the city over the course of the 16th century. Built in part from the revenues of a trading empire and the labor of people who had not asked for it to be there. The intra-Asian trade that the cartaz system taxed was, by the mid-16th century, generating more revenue for the Estado than the direct spice trade to Europe. Portuguese merchants, operating partly within and partly around the crown monopoly, moved cotton textiles from Gujarat to Malacca, yet horses from Arabia to the Deccan kingdoms, copper from Europe to India, Chinese porcelain to the Persian Gulf. The empire was not simply extracting from Asia and sending the proceeds to Lisbon. It was embedded in Asian commerce at every level, with Portuguese captains, casados, the settler community of Portuguese men who had married local women under Albuquerque's deliberate policy, and their Eurasian descendants acting as brokers, factors, and intermediaries throughout the network. The Estado was not a simple extraction mechanism. It was a parasite that had grown so deeply into its host that the two had become, in places, impossible to separate. By the time Goa reached what later observers called its golden age, roughly 1575 to 1625, the city was home to a population of perhaps 75,000 people, or a cosmopolitan mix of Portuguese officials, Eurasian casados, Hindu merchants operating under cartaz license, African slaves sold at auction in the main street, Jesuit missionaries preparing for their next assignment in Japan, and the representatives of every commercial interest that the Indian Ocean touched. It was one of the great cities of the 16th century world. It was also, structurally, a city built on coercion, on the cartaz fee paid under the implicit threat of confiscation, the customs duty paid under the shadow of the patrol fleet, the conversion performed under the eye of the Inquisition. The wealth was real. The violence that sustained it was equally real. Both things were true of Goa, and both were true of everything the Estado da India had built. The Portuguese enterprise in the Indian Ocean was, and from the Ottoman perspective, an act of economic warfare against the Islamic world, and the Ottomans were not slow to recognize it as such. When Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and appeared at Calicut in 1498, the revenues that had flowed through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf for centuries, the spice duties collected at Aden, the customs fees at Jeddah, the transit taxes that had helped sustain Cairo, Baghdad, and Constantinople, began to erode. Portugal was not simply building a trading empire. It was rerouting the fiscal arteries of the Ottoman world through a channel it owned and controlled at the opposite end of the continent, beyond the reach of any Ottoman fleet. The first coordinated Muslim response came not from the Ottomans directly, but from the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which had the most immediate stake in reversing the Portuguese disruption. The Mamluks controlled Alexandria, the Mediterranean terminal of the spice trade, and their treasury depended on the transit revenues that the Portuguese Cape route was draining away. In 1507, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Kansu al-Ghauri appealed to the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II for naval assistance. The Ottomans shipped Mediterranean-style war galleys overland in pieces to the Red Sea port of Suez, where Venetian shipwrights, who had their own reasons for wanting the Portuguese stopped, helped reassemble them. The combined fleet that resulted sailed south through the Indian Ocean, hugging the coast, to challenge the Portuguese at Diu. In the Battle of Diu on the 3rd of February, 1509, was the first and most consequential test of the Portuguese naval system against a serious coalition opponent. The combined fleet, Mamluk galleys, Ottoman volunteers, Gujarati warships, and vessels from the Zamorin of Calicut, outnumbered the Portuguese by roughly 10-1 in hulls. Francisco de Almeida, the Portuguese viceroy whose son had been killed in an earlier skirmish, arrived with 19 ocean-going ships and approximately 1,200 men. The galleys the Mamluks and Ottomans had brought from the Mediterranean were built for rowing in calm inland seas. They carried light cannon at bow and stern, but nothing along the sides, because the ore banks made broadside artillery impossible. Against Portuguese carracks firing broadside from elevated gun decks, and they were structurally outclassed before the fighting began. The battle was over in hours. The Portuguese broadsides tore through the lighter galleys at close range. The Mamluk and Ottoman crews, trained for the boarding actions of Mediterranean warfare, could not close the distance to make their numbers count. The Gujarat and Calicut reinforcements, shallow draft local vessels with minimal armament, added to the body count without affecting the outcome. Almeida's treatment of the prisoners was savage even by the standards of the time. Survivors were hanged, burned alive, or torn apart by cannon fire in deliberate retribution for his son's death. After the battle, he delivered his assessment in a single sentence: "As long as you are powerful at sea, you will hold India as yours. If you lose that power, a fortress on shore will avail you nothing." It was the clearest statement anyone had yet made of the empire's operating logic. The Ottoman Empire absorbed the lesson of Diu and drew the correct strategic conclusions. Sultan Selim I conquered the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517, absorbing Egypt, Syria, and the Red Sea ports of Suez and Jeddah into the Ottoman domain. The problem Portugal had been creating for the Mamluks was now the Ottoman Empire's problem directly. Selim's son, Suleiman the Magnificent, who came to the throne in 1520 and who was fighting the Habsburgs in Europe and the Safavids in Persia simultaneously, understood that the Indian Ocean contest was a third front he could not afford to ignore. The Portuguese fortresses at Hormuz, Goa, and Malacca represented a physical encirclement of the Islamic trading world, a Christian chain of command wrapped around the routes that fed Ottoman commerce and Ottoman revenues. Suleiman's response operated on several levels simultaneously. Directly, he dispatched Hadim Suleiman Pasha with 90 galleys to India in 1538, the largest Ottoman naval force ever sent into the Indian Ocean, to besiege the Portuguese fortress at Diu and break the stranglehold on the Arabian Sea. The siege failed. The Gujarat Sultan, whose alliance had been the strategic foundation of the operation, had been killed in murky circumstances during negotiations with the Portuguese. His successor had switched sides, and Hadim Suleiman arrived to find his local partner gone and the fortress fully garrisoned. He withdrew, captured most of Yemen on his way home, and secured the Red Sea coast for the Ottomans, a partial but meaningful consolation that kept the overland route viable even if the oceanic route remained blocked. Indirectly, the Ottomans deployed the tools of proxy warfare across 3 continents. In the Horn of Africa, Ottoman gunners and advisors supported the Adil Sultanate's invasion of Christian Ethiopia in the 1540s, a campaign that nearly toppled Emperor Lebna Dengel, and that Portugal countered by sending 400 soldiers under Cristóvão da Gama, a son of Vasco, to fight alongside the Ethiopian army. Cristóvão da Gama was captured and executed in 1542. His small force held on until an Ethiopian counterattack drove the Adil forces back. At the far end of the Indian Ocean, the Ottomans cultivated the Sultanate of Aceh in northern Sumatra, a Muslim polity that shared a border with Portuguese Malacca and had every incentive to attack it. Ottoman cannon, engineers, and technical advisors arrived in Aceh from the 1530s onward, arming a proxy that could threaten Malacca from a position no Ottoman fleet could reach directly. The outcome of this decades-long contest was a strategic stalemate that neither side fully acknowledged. By the 1560s, more trade moved on Muslim ships than on Portuguese ones, and Alexandria had revived as a functioning spice market. The overland route had not been killed, only diminished. The Ottomans had secured the Red Sea and kept the Persian Gulf partially viable. But they had never broken the Portuguese grip on the oceanic route, never dislodged Portugal from Hormuz or Goa or Malacca. In the end, both empires settled into adjacent spheres of influence. The Ottomans dominating the overland routes in the Red Sea, the Portuguese dominating the Cape route, and the Indian Ocean's deep water lanes. And the great contest between them quietly subsided, not with a peace treaty, but with mutual exhaustion. The rival that would actually dismantle the Portuguese Empire was not the Ottoman Empire. It was a nation that had not yet existed when the first Portuguese caravel rounded Cape Bojador. For the first 3 decades after Cabral's accidental landfall, Portugal treated Brazil as a problem to be managed rather than an opportunity to be seized. The Estado da India was generating revenues that dwarfed anything the South American coast could offer. Brazil had no spice, no gold, no silver, and no established trading cities whose commerce could be taxed. What it had was Brazilwood, a dense hardwood that yielded a vivid red dye prized by European textile manufacturers. And that was initially enough to sustain a modest operation. The Crown licensed Brazilwood extraction to a consortium of new Christian merchants, mostly converted Jews, who built a handful of trading posts along the coast and exchanged cloth and tools with the Tupi-speaking peoples of the littoral for the timber they needed. It was not an empire. It was a logging concession. The French changed that calculation. French traders appeared on the Brazilian coast in the 1520s, built their own relationships with indigenous communities, and began shipping Brazilwood north to Normandy in quantities that eroded the Portuguese monopoly. But the French crown, which had never accepted the Treaty of Tordesillas and saw no reason why 2 Iberian kingdoms should divide the world between themselves, actively encouraged it. King John III of Portugal faced a choice: invest in the territory or lose it. In September 1532, he issued a decree establishing 15 hereditary captaincies, vast land grants stretching inland from the coast, and assigned them to minor nobles and merchants with the resources and inclination to develop them at their own expense. The Crown provided the legal framework. The captains provided everything else. 13 of the 15 captaincies failed. The land was vast. The jungle was impenetrable. The indigenous populations were resistant, and the investors were undercapitalized and often incompetent. On 2 captaincies succeeded: Pernambuco in the northeast and São Vicente in the south, and both succeeded for the same reason: sugar. The Madeira template, transported wholesale to a continent-sized landmass, worked. The soil of the northeast coast proved ideal for cane. The Genoese and Flemish banking networks that had financed Madeiran sugar were available to finance Brazilian sugar. The Feitorias of the African coast could supply the labor. In 1549, King John III appointed Tomé de Sousa as the first Governor-General of Brazil and established Salvador da Bahia as the colonial capital, centralizing what had been a collection of failing private ventures into a single administered colony. The Brazilwood concession had become an empire. The labor that powered the Brazilian sugar economy arrived in two stages. Initially, Portuguese colonists enslaved indigenous Tupinamba and other coastal peoples through force and through the legal fiction of just war. People captured in legitimate conflict could be enslaved, and conflict with indigenous communities was never difficult to manufacture. Indigenous enslaved workers cleared the fields, worked the mills, and died in large numbers from European diseases to which they had no immunity. By mid-century, the coastal indigenous populations had been so reduced by disease, violence, and enslavement that they could no longer supply the workforce the sugar economy required. The planters turned to Africa. The first direct transatlantic slave voyage from Africa to Brazil was completed in 1526. By the 1560s, systematic slave trading from Portuguese Angola to the Engenhos of Pernambuco was fully operational. The city of Luanda, founded on the Angolan coast in 1575, existed for one primary purpose: to organize and export enslaved people to Brazil. Ships left Luanda carrying between 100 and 350 people in conditions designed to maximize cargo density and minimize cost, arrived in Recife or Salvador after a crossing of 5 to 8 weeks, unloaded their human cargo at the dockside slave market, and sailed home with sugar. Between 1501 and 1866, an estimated 4.9 million enslaved Africans arrived in Brazil. More than in any other country in the Americas, more than 40% of the entire transatlantic slave trade. The plantation system that Henry the Navigator had proved viable in Madeira had scaled across a century and a half to an operation of continental dimensions. The sugar economy that resulted was, and for most of the 16th and early 17th centuries, the most productive agricultural operation in the Atlantic world. By 1570, Brazil had 60 sugar mills. By 1645, it had 350. The northeast coast, Pernambuco, Bahia, the river valleys running inland from the ports, was a landscape transformed entirely by the demands of a European commodity market. The forests were cleared, the rivers were dammed and diverted, and the land was planted in cane from the coast to the edge of what the workforce could reach. The wealth it generated flowed north to Lisbon, west to Antwerp, and east to the Genoese banking houses that had been financing Portuguese expansion since the Madeiran sugar operations of the 1450s. The people who grew the crop, processed it, and shipped it lived and died in conditions that the system treated as an operating cost. Gold arrived later and transformed the empire again. Bandeirantes, the paramilitary adventurers who had been pushing into the Brazilian interior since the late 16th century in search of indigenous slaves and mineral wealth, found gold in the region of Minas Gerais in 1693. The discovery triggered the largest gold rush in the Atlantic world to that point. Within 4 decades, the population of Minas Gerais had reached between 200,000 and 250,000 people, drawn from Portugal, from the coastal colonies, and from the holds of slave ships. By the mid-18th century, Brazilian gold constituted roughly 46% of the colony's total exports. Portugal's entire European position, its capacity to trade, to service its debts, and to maintain the appearance of a great power, rested on revenue extracted from a continent it had reached by accident and spent a century learning to exploit. By 1750, Brazil had long since overtaken the Estado da India as the empire's primary economic engine. The Asian Empire was eroding. The Dutch had taken Malacca in 1641. The English had displaced Portugal in India. The cartaz revenues were declining. Brazil was the empire. The colony, founded on a logging concession, built on captive labor, and sustained by the accumulated knowledge of the Madeiran plantation system, was now the reason Portugal remained a functioning imperial power at all. The irony was structural. The empire that had been built looking east, toward the spice routes and the choke points of the Indian Ocean, thus survived into the 18th century because of a continent to the west that nobody in Lisbon had been looking for. The economic consequences of the Portuguese Cape route were real, profound, and considerably more complicated than the simple story of Venice collapsing overnight suggests. When Cabral's Armada returned to Lisbon in 1501 with the first commercially significant spice cargo sourced directly from India, the price of pepper in Lisbon fell to roughly a fifth of the prevailing Venetian price. The Fugger banking house of Augsburg, which had been purchasing its pepper through Venice for generations, sent its representatives to Lisbon to negotiate directly. The Imhoff family, which had effectively held a monopoly on the German pepper trade through Venice, redirected its purchasing agents to Antwerp, where the Portuguese Feitoria was selling Asian goods at prices the overland route could not match. The mechanics of a centuries-old commercial system began to shift within a decade of Vasco da Gama's first return. Antwerp was the principal beneficiary of that shift, and its rise was as consequential as Venice's relative decline. The city sat at the junction of the Rhine trade, the North Sea, and the Atlantic coast, a natural distribution hub for goods arriving by sea from Lisbon. From the first years of the 16th century, the Portuguese crown operated a trading house in Antwerp, the Feitoria de Flandre, that sold Asian spices to the merchants of Northern Europe at prices that undercut the Venetian route by enough to redirect substantial commercial traffic. The Flemish textile merchants who had previously sent their cloth over the Alpine passes to exchange for Venetian spices now found the same spices arriving by sea at a harbor they already used. Antwerp's population roughly doubled between 1500 and 1560. Its bourse, the world's first purpose-built commodity exchange, opened in 1531. The Atlantic economy had a new center. Venice did not simply collapse. The resilience of the most serene republic was, in its way, as impressive as its vulnerability. The Venetian government recognized the threat early, lobbied the Mamluk Sultanate to reduce transit duties so that Levantine spices could compete on price, and by 1515 had renegotiated its trading agreements with the Ottomans, who had absorbed the Mamluks in 1517, to keep the Alexandria spice route open. By the 1530s, Venetian spices were back in European markets in significant quantities, dominating 85% of the lion spice trade and competing successfully even in Antwerp itself. The Cape route had not killed the overland route. It had forced a renegotiation of its terms, and those new terms were, for a generation, competitive enough to sustain Venice as a major commercial power. What the Portuguese disruption ultimately produced was not the replacement of one monopoly with another, but the fracturing of the spice trade into a genuinely competitive market for the first time in a century. Portuguese merchants, Venetian merchants, and increasingly English and Dutch interlopers competed for the same trade simultaneously, and competition, as it tends to do, drove prices down for buyers while compressing margins for sellers. If the Fugger family, which had co-financed Portuguese expansion and sold Asian spices through Antwerp, found by mid-century that the spice trade, once the most reliable large-scale arbitrage in the European economy, was no longer generating the returns that had made it worth financing. The price of pepper in European consumer markets fell by roughly 2/3 over the course of the 16th century. The trade remained profitable. It was no longer extraordinarily profitable. The Arab and Gujarati merchant communities of the Indian Ocean absorbed the most direct damage. The cartaz system taxed every vessel that moved through Portuguese-controlled waters, and Portuguese patrol ships seized, sank, or burned those that refused to pay. The merchants who had built the Indian Ocean's commercial infrastructure over centuries, the Gujarati cotton traders, the Arab dhow captains running the route from Malabar to Aden, the Swahili merchants of the East African coast, found themselves operating in a sea that had been redefined as Portuguese sovereign territory. Some adapted, paying the cartaz fee as a cost of business. Others were driven from routes they had used for generations. The East African port cities, Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, whose prosperity had rested on the free movement of Indian Ocean commerce, entered a slow decline from which several never recovered. And the larger shift that Portugal had initiated, the reorientation of global trade from the Mediterranean and overland routes to the Atlantic and oceanic routes, was the most durable consequence of the enterprise, and it outlasted Portugal's capacity to control it. By the mid-16th century, the Atlantic economy was growing faster than the Mediterranean economy, and that growth had a momentum that no single power could own. The Fuggers and the Welsers of Augsburg, the merchant adventurers of London, the Protestant merchants of Amsterdam, all of them were building wealth in an Atlantic commercial system whose architecture Portugal had constructed and whose rules Portugal had, for a generation, set. When the Dutch arrived with their own ships, their own capital, and their own willingness to apply violence systematically, they did not need to build a new system. They only needed to take the one Portugal had built and operate it more efficiently. The stranglehold Portugal had spent a century constructing was, in the end, a transferable asset. At the height of its Asian empire, in roughly the 1540s, Portugal was administering a maritime network stretching 14,000 kilometers from Mozambique to Macau, with a home population of somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people. Spain, its nearest rival in scale of ambition, had perhaps 6 million. France had 15 million. The Ottoman Empire had perhaps 25 million. Portugal was not simply a small nation with a large empire. It was a nation whose empire was structurally incompatible with its size. An organism that had grown a skeleton several times too large for the body it was attached to, and that was now keeping itself upright through extraordinary expenditure of energy and an almost total commitment of its available human stock. Every year, between 2,000 and 3,000 men left Lisbon on the India Run, the Carrera de India, and a significant proportion of them did not return. The voyage itself killed, through scurvy, dysentery, and shipwreck, on average between 10 and 20% of every fleet before it reached Goa. Tropical diseases, malaria, cholera, and the cluster of fevers that Portuguese accounts described simply as the sickness of the land, killed a further portion in the first year of service in India. Thus, the men who made it through 2 or 3 years of active service in the Estado da India and survived to sail home were a minority of those who had departed. Portugal was feeding its young men into the empire at a rate that, by the mid-16th century, was measurably depleting the rural workforce at home and creating labor shortages that helped drive the demand for enslaved workers in domestic Portuguese agriculture. The mathematics of garrisoning the empire were no better. The entire Estado da India, at its maximum operational extent, was held by approximately 16,000 Portuguese soldiers and sailors scattered across dozens of fortresses and feitorias from East Africa to the South China Sea. 16,000 men across 14,000 kilometers of ocean, an average of roughly 1 soldier per kilometer of coastline, in theory. In practice, the garrisons clustered at the key nodes: Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, Mozambique. The stretches between them were patrolled by the cartaz fleet and held by the assumption that no single rival could concentrate enough force to threaten more than one point at a time. That assumption held for about a century. When the Dutch arrived with the capital to build a naval force larger than Portugal's and the institutional discipline to deploy it systematically, the assumption was exposed as the gamble it had always been. The corruption that pervaded the Estado da India, the private trading, the embezzlement, the systematic underreporting of customs revenues, was not a moral failure that better governance could have corrected. It was a predictable response to the incentive structure of an empire that was too large to supervise. A viceroy in Goa was 9 to 12 months of correspondence from Lisbon and operated with almost total practical autonomy. A fortress commander on the Swahili coast was functionally beyond any oversight at all. The men posted to these positions came from families that had spent real money to secure the appointments. They had come to get rich. The mechanisms for getting rich without the crown's permission, the private cartaz sold outside the official system, the cargo space quietly allocated to a merchant's goods, the customs valuation arrived at after a private conversation, were available to every official in the chain. Nearly all of them used them. The empire leaked revenue at every joint, and the leakage was structural. So the Carrera de India, the annual fleet from Lisbon to Goa and back, was the circulatory system of the empire and its most visible point of fragility. Each fleet typically comprised between 5 and 20 ships, each ship carrying between 300 and 800 tons of cargo. A good season delivered spices, silks, and pepper to Lisbon at prices that justified the entire enterprise. A bad season, a fleet scattered by storms off the Cape, ships lost off the Mozambique Channel, a garrison under siege that had consumed the available cargo, produced losses that could wipe out several years of accumulated profit. The investment required to build, man, and equip each fleet was enormous. The risks were existential. The Casa de India in Lisbon managed the accounting. But the accounting was only as accurate as the reports arriving from Goa, and the reports were only as accurate as the officials writing them. The empire's finances were never fully transparent to anyone, including the crown. What sustained the empire for as long as it survived was not Portuguese strength. It was the absence, for most of the 16th century, of a rival with the combination of naval power, capital, and institutional organization to challenge it systematically. The Ottomans had the naval power, but not the oceanic range. The Zamorans and the Gujarati sultans had the local knowledge, but not the artillery advantage. Rival European powers, England, France, the emerging Dutch Republic, were present in the Indian Ocean by the late 16th century, but not yet in sufficient force to displace an established system. Portugal held the empire not because it was strong enough to hold it indefinitely, but because no single adversary was yet strong enough to take it. The window was finite, and everyone in Lisbon who paid attention knew it. The poet Luís de Camões sailed to India in 1553 as a common soldier, lost an eye fighting in Morocco, spent 17 years in the East, and was shipwrecked off the Mekong Delta, and returned to Lisbon in 1570 with the manuscript of Os Lusíadas, the national epic, the poem that celebrated Portugal's maritime achievement in the most ambitious verse the language had yet produced. He died in 1580, the same year Spain absorbed Portugal and the empire began its terminal descent. He died in poverty, reportedly sharing his last meal with his servant, and the man who had written the definitive celebration of Portuguese greatness was buried in an unmarked grave. The empire that had inspired the poem was already, in the year he died, beginning to come apart at the seams. Both things, the greatness and the poverty, the ambition and the cost, were Portugal's in equal measure, and neither cancels the other out. On the 4th of August, 1578, King Sebastian of Portugal rode into battle at Alcácer Quibir in Morocco, at the head of a crusading army of roughly 18,000 men. He was 24 years old, had never fought a serious campaign, and had assembled the expedition on the basis of a religious conviction that God would reward the faithful with victory over the Moroccan Sultan. The battle lasted less than a day. Sebastian's army was encircled and destroyed by a Moroccan force of approximately 40,000. Sebastian himself died in the fighting. His body was never definitively identified on the field. Almost the entire military nobility of Portugal died with him or was taken prisoner. The ransom payments that followed drained the treasury. The king had left no heir. In 2 years, the House of Aviz, which had ruled Portugal since 1385 and launched the empire from its first expedition to Ceuta, was extinct. The succession crisis that followed was resolved in the way that succession crises in weak states usually are, by the nearest powerful neighbor. Philip II of Spain was the grandson of King Manuel I of Portugal on his mother's side, giving him a dynastic claim that was legitimate, if not the strongest available. He also had money, an army, thus and the Duke of Alba, who had already demonstrated in the Netherlands what Spanish military discipline looked like, applied to a reluctant population. Philip marched into Portugal in 1580, defeated the forces of the rival claimant Antonio, prior of Credo, at the Battle of Alcantara, and was acclaimed king by the Portuguese Cortes at Tomar in April 1581. He was said to have summarized his position with characteristic terseness. "I inherited it, I bought it, and I conquered it. The House of Aviz was dead, the Iberian Union had begun. Philip made substantial promises at Tomar. Portugal would keep its own laws, its own currency, its own administration, its own trade monopolies. The Portuguese Empire would be governed by Portuguese officials. No Spanish troops would be garrisoned on Portuguese soil in peacetime." The two crowns were united in his person alone. They were not merging into a single state. The promises were broadly kept under Philip II and less well kept under his successors. What could not be promised, because it was a structural fact that no treaty language could alter, was this: the enemies of Spain were now the enemies of Portugal, whether Portugal wished it or not. England had been Portugal's oldest formal ally. The Treaty of Windsor in 1386 had bound the two crowns together for over 2 centuries. That alliance ended when Portugal entered personal union with the country England was fighting. In 1592, an English fleet operating in the Atlantic seized the Portuguese carrack Madre de Deus off the Azores. The ship was carrying 900 tons of merchandise from India and China: silks, spices, jewels, ebony, as in carpets, with an estimated value of £500,000, roughly half the size of the entire English treasury at the time. The sailors who boarded it had never seen wealth on that scale in one place. Their accounts circulated in London and did something Philip had not intended. They told the English exactly how much the Eastern trade was worth and exactly where to find it. The Dutch presented an altogether more systematic threat. The 7 northern provinces of the Netherlands had been in open revolt against Habsburg rule since 1568, and Philip II had responded by cutting off Dutch access to the spice markets of Lisbon. The port, where Dutch merchants had for decades purchased Asian goods for distribution across northern Europe. The embargo did not stop Dutch demand for spice. It redirected Dutch ambition. If they could no longer buy spice from the Portuguese, they would go to the source themselves. In 1595, the first Dutch fleet of 4 ships under Cornelis de Houtman left the Dutch port of Texel bound for Java. 3 ships returned in 1597, having lost 70% of the crew to disease and skirmishes along the route. The voyage barely broke even. A second fleet followed immediately. A third was already being planned before the second returned. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, was chartered in 1602, and it was a different kind of instrument from anything Portugal had built. The Estado da India was a crown operation, dependent on royal funding, royal appointments, and the slow machinery of Lisbon bureaucracy. The VOC was a joint stock company, and capitalized by thousands of private investors across the Dutch Republic, authorized by the States General to wage war, make treaties, and govern territory in its own name. It combined the commercial incentives of private enterprise with the coercive powers of a state, and it answered to shareholders who expected returns. It was not exploring or crusading or converting. It was operating, systematically, efficiently, and without sentiment. The war that followed was global in a way that no previous conflict had been. Between 1598 and 1663, Dutch forces attacked Portuguese positions on 4 continents and 7 seas simultaneously. In Asia, The VOC captured the Spice Islands in 1605, Malacca in 1641, Colombo in 1656, Ceylon in 1658, not in Cochin. The city Duarte Pacheco Pereira had held against 80,000 men with 150. In 1662. In West Africa, the Dutch took Elmina in 1637, Luanda in 1641, and Axum in 1642, severing the supply chain that fed the Brazilian plantation economy. In Brazil itself, the Dutch West India Company seized Bahia in 1624, lost it in 1625, seized Pernambuco, the richest sugar-producing region in the Atlantic world, in 1630, and held it for 24 years. At its maximum extent in the early 1640s, the Dutch controlled more of Brazil by area than the Portuguese did. Portugal broke from the Iberian Union in December 1640, exploiting the moment when Spain was distracted by the Catalan revolt. The Duke of Braganza was proclaimed King João IV. The House of Braganza replaced the Habsburgs. And Portugal had its sovereignty back. The Dutch, despite the change, continued their offensive. The VOC was fighting for commercial dominance, not in solidarity with Spain, and a newly independent Portugal represented the same threat to their Asian monopoly as a Habsburg one. The Portuguese Restoration War against Spain and the Dutch-Portuguese War ran simultaneously for nearly 2 decades, draining a country that had no reserves left to drain. By the Treaty of The Hague in 1661, the Dutch-Portuguese War formally ended. The terms were a reckoning. Portugal acknowledged Dutch possession of almost all the Asian territories the VOC had taken. In exchange, the Dutch returned Recife and the Brazilian coast, accepted a substantial cash payment, and agreed to restore commercial relations. Portugal kept Brazil and Angola. It lost the Asian empire that Albuquerque had built. The cartaz system, the lock on the world's trade routes that Gama had formalized and Albuquerque had constructed into a continental architecture, was dismantled fortress by fortress over 60 years by a company of Dutch shareholders who had learned the stranglehold logic from the Portuguese example and applied it with greater capital, greater efficiency, and no crusading ideology to slow them down. On the morning of the 1st of November 1755, All Saints' Day, the population of Lisbon was in church. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, the ground moved. 3 successive tremors, the largest estimated at magnitude 8.5, struck the city over the course of 10 minutes. The churches collapsed first, burying their congregations under vaulted stone. And the royal palace, the opera house, the patriarchal church, all newly completed, all destroyed within minutes. The candles lit throughout the city for the holy day ignited the ruins, and a firestorm consumed what the earthquake had left standing. 40 minutes after the first tremor, the sea receded from the harbor, exposing the mud of the Tagus bed and the wreckage of old shipwrecks. And then the tsunami arrived, 3 waves in succession, the first 12 meters high, surging up the river and through the lower city. Between 30 and 40,000 people died in Lisbon alone. What died with them in the warehouses along the waterfront was a significant portion of the empire's institutional memory. The Casa de India, the administrative center that managed all colonial trade and maintained the records of the empire's commercial operations, was destroyed. The archives of centuries of maritime intelligence, trade agreements, and navigational charts went with it. The one surviving warehouse, Hakai magazine later noted, held an estimated 1.5% of Portugal's entire GDP in Brazilian diamonds at the moment it was consumed. The Marquis of Pombal, the king's chief minister, organized the reconstruction with impressive efficiency, burying the dead, pressing survivors into rubble clearance, and redesigning the lower city on a rational grid. He rebuilt Lisbon. He could not rebuild what the archives had contained. Brazil sustained the empire through the 18th century on the revenues of sugar and gold. And it was Brazil that determined the empire's next transformation. In November 1807, Napoleon's army crossed the Spanish border into Portugal, executing the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau that had divided the Iberian Peninsula between France and Spain. The Portuguese royal family, warned in advance through British intelligence, made a decision without precedent in European history. Rather than face occupation or capture, they boarded ship and relocated the entire court to Rio de Janeiro. 15 ships carried approximately 10,000 people: the royal family, the nobility, the government, the treasury, the royal library, and the apparatus of the Portuguese state, across the Atlantic under British naval escort. Portugal, for the first time in its history, ceased to be the center of its own empire. The relocation that was intended as a temporary wartime measure became something more permanent in its consequences. In 1815, Brazil was elevated to the status of a kingdom co-equal with Portugal, the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, with Rio de Janeiro as its capital. When the Napoleonic Wars ended and the Liberal Revolution of 1820 forced King João VI back to Lisbon, he left his son Pedro behind as regent. In September 1822, on the plain of Ipiranga near São Paulo, Pedro declared Brazil independent and himself its emperor. He was 24 years old, born in Portugal, ruling with the support of the Brazilian planter class and the tacit encouragement of the British, who had every commercial reason to want Brazil as a free trading partner rather than a Portuguese monopoly colony. Portugal acknowledged the independence in 1825 in exchange for a substantial indemnity payment and trade concessions. The largest colony in the Atlantic world, the financial engine that had kept Portugal solvent for a century and a half, was gone. What remained of the empire after 1822 was Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, the Cape Verde Islands, São Tomé, Goa, Macau, and East Timor, a collection of African territories, a handful of Asian enclaves, and the accumulated prestige of a name that had once governed half the world's trade. Portugal turned to Africa with the energy that the loss of Brazil demanded. Through the second half of the 19th century, Portuguese expeditions pushed inland from the coastal settlements of Angola and Mozambique, mapping the interior, negotiating or fighting their way into territories that had been nominally Portuguese for centuries, but effectively ungoverned. The project to connect Angola and Mozambique by a continuous belt of Portuguese territory across the continent, the Mapa Cor-de-Rosa, the Pink Map, was the last expression of genuine imperial ambition that Portugal could muster. On the 11th of January 1890, the British government delivered an ultimatum. Lord Salisbury's memorandum demanded that Portugal withdraw its forces from the territory between Angola and Mozambique immediately, the land that is today Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, or face a complete break in diplomatic relations with its oldest ally and, implicitly, the Royal Navy. Cecil Rhodes had plans for a continuous British corridor from Cairo to Cape Town, knowing Portugal's Pink Map ran directly through the middle of it. King Carlos I accepted the ultimatum within 24 hours. The humiliation was total. Portugal had been a British ally since 1386. The Treaty of Windsor was the oldest diplomatic treaty still nominally in force, and it had just been overruled by a British Prime Minister's letter as if it were a minor colonial inconvenience rather than a sovereign kingdom. The Republican movement, which had been growing for years, acquired in that moment the popular anger it needed to become a genuine political force. The monarchy did not survive the decade that followed. On the 1st of February 1908, King Carlos I and his heir Crown Prince Luís Felipe were shot dead in an open carriage in the streets of Lisbon by two Republican activists. So the younger son, Manuel II, succeeded to a throne that had been fatally compromised. On the 5th of October 1910, a military coup backed by the Republican movement overthrew the monarchy. Manuel II fled to Gibraltar and then to England, where he lived out the rest of his life in exile. Portugal was declared a republic. The House of Braganza, which had reclaimed the throne from the Habsburgs in 1640 and governed the empire through its long decline, was finished. The republic proved no more stable than the monarchy it replaced. Between 1910 and 1926, Portugal endured 45 different governments, 8 presidents, and multiple attempted coups. In 1933, as a quiet economics professor named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar formalized his control of the state into a right-wing authoritarian regime called the Estado Novo, the New State, which suspended democratic politics, suppressed dissent, and held the remaining colonies with a tenacity that was, by the mid-20th century, becoming untenable. When India gained independence from Britain in 1947 and the new Indian state demanded that Portugal's enclaves of Goa, Damão, and Diu be incorporated, Salazar refused. Indian troops marched into Goa in December 1961. Salazar declared the annexation illegal and maintained his position until his death. Goa, the city that had been the jewel of the Estado da India, the city that had once made people say that he who had seen Goa need not see Lisbon, was Portuguese no longer. The colonial wars in Africa consumed the last resources the empire had. From 1961, Portugal fought simultaneously against independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. A three-front guerrilla war against opponents supplied by the Soviet Union, fought in terrain where Portugal's conventional military advantages counted for little. By 1974, the war was absorbing 40% of the national budget and 45% of all government expenditure. Junior officers, exhausted and radicalized, had had enough. On the 25th of April 1974, the armed forces movement staged a coup in Lisbon so carefully planned and so broadly supported that it succeeded in hours with almost no bloodshed. The signal to begin was a banned protest song played on state radio at midnight. Carnations were placed in the barrels of soldiers' rifles. The dictatorship fell. Angola and Mozambique became independent in 1975. East Timor followed. The African Empire was over. On the 20th of December 1999, the last piece of Portuguese imperial territory was handed over. Macau, the trading post established on the South China coast in 1557, the oldest continuous European settlement in Asia, was returned to the People's Republic of China in a formal ceremony attended by the Portuguese president and the Chinese premier. It had been Portuguese, in name at least, for 442 years. With its handover, the Portuguese Empire, the first global empire in human history, the enterprise that Henry the Navigator had begun with a caravel and a string of trading posts along the West African coast 5.5 centuries earlier, came formally to its end. The Portuguese Empire lasted in one form or another for 584 years, from the capture of Ceuta in 1415 to the handover of Macau in 1999. No other European empire came close to that duration. The British Empire, at its maximum extent far larger and more powerful, lasted roughly 3.5 centuries in its full colonial form. The Spanish Empire, which shared Iberia and ambition with Portugal, dissolved its continental American holdings in the 1820s. Portugal was still flying its flag over Asian territory when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, still governing African colonies when the Vietnam War ended, and still handing over Chinese territory when Google was founded. The longevity was not an accident. It was a function of the same strategic logic that had built the empire in the first place. Concentrate force at the choke points, hold the water, and let everything else follow. The sea routes that Portuguese navigators charted in the 15th and 16th centuries are still the arteries of the modern global economy. The Cape Route around southern Africa, which Bartholomew Dias proved navigable in 1488, and which Vasco da Gama first used commercially in 1497, carries today an estimated 800 million tons of cargo annually. Oil from the Persian Gulf, grain from South America, manufactured goods from Asia, or from southern Africa. The Strait of Malacca, which Albuquerque seized in 1511 and which the VOC took from Portugal in 1641, carries roughly 40% of the world's seaborne trade today. The choke points that Albuquerque identified as the locks on the world's commerce in 1510 are, 5 centuries later, still the locks on the world's commerce. The geography did not change. Only the flags above the fortresses changed. Portuguese is spoken today by approximately 260 million people across 9 countries on 4 continents. It is the 6th most widely spoken language in the world and the most widely spoken language in the Southern Hemisphere. More than 80% of those speakers live in Brazil, a country of 215 million people whose entire national identity, legal system, religious tradition, and cultural expression were shaped by a colonial enterprise that began with a logging concession and was sustained, as for 2 centuries, by the largest forced migration in human history. The language is alive and growing. The demographic projections suggest it will reach 400 million speakers by the end of this century, driven almost entirely by population growth in Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique. The empire is gone. The language it planted is accelerating. The slave trade that powered the Portuguese Atlantic Empire was the most consequential act of forced displacement in recorded history. Between 1501 and 1866, an estimated 4.9 million enslaved Africans arrived in Brazil alone. Across the entire Portuguese Empire, including the internal West African trade, the São Tomé and Cape Verde operations, and the direct Angolan trade, the total number of people transported, sold, and worked to death in service of the plantation system ran well into the millions beyond that figure. The societies from which they were taken, the kingdoms of Congo, of Ndongo, of Ouida, the trading cities of the Swahili coast, were destabilized, depopulated, and in some cases permanently destroyed by the sustained extraction of their people. Those consequences did not end with abolition. They are present in the economic geography of West and Central Africa today. The first globalization, the integration of previously separate regional economies into a single interconnected system, was a Portuguese project, not exclusively. The Spanish contribution across the Pacific and the Americas was enormous. But the framework, the operating logic, the institutional templates, the joint stock trading company, the fortified trading post, the license monopoly, the cartaz as a model for taxing maritime commerce, were all Portuguese inventions or Portuguese adaptations, refined through a century of practice and inherited by every European power that followed. The Dutch 50C, the British East India Company, the French Compagnie des Indes, all were built on a model that Portugal had prototyped. The world they created, a world of interconnected oceanic trade governed by the threat of naval force and taxed at choke points, is the world we still live in. What Portugal got for its investment was, by the measure of the crown and the merchant houses, considerable. The revenues of the spice trade financed the most concentrated flowering of art, architecture, and literature in Portuguese history. The Manueline style, the Jerónimos Monastery, the Tower of Belém, Os Lusíadas, the gold of Brazil paid for the gilded interiors of Lisbon's churches and the maintenance of a European power's pretensions long after the underlying strength had eroded. What Portugal paid for it was the lives of a significant proportion of several generations of its young men, the permanent depopulation of its rural interior, and a national psychology shaped by an imperial ambition that its demographic reality could never quite sustain. The greatness was real. The cost was real. Neither forecloses the other. There is a word in Portuguese, saudade, that the language's speakers will tell you cannot be translated. It describes a longing for something loved and lost, a melancholy pleasure in the memory of what is gone, a feeling that is neither grief nor nostalgia, but occupies the space between them. The Portuguese did not invent the feeling. Every culture has a version of it, but they named it and they made it the emotional signature of their national identity, in the fado music that emerged from the alleys of Lisbon, in the literature that runs from Camões to Pessoa, in the particular register of a small nation that once held the world and knows with quiet precision exactly what it has let go. The empire built that feeling. 5 centuries later, the feeling is all that is left of the empire, that and the roots that carry the world's goods across the same water that Portuguese sailors first charted, still moving, still essential, still indifferent to the flags that claim to own them.